On the evening of the 17th of October 2020, in a quiet conference room on the 20th floor of a Sydney high-rise, a softly spoken commercial barrister named Adam Bell SC opened a manila folder. He began reading from a brief that would, in just over 12 months, dismantle the most powerful gambling company in the Southern Hemisphere. The brief was thick. It contained internal emails, surveillance footage, bank records, and the names of men who, until that week, had been treated by the New South Wales government as nation builders. Across town, in a glass tower on Barangaroo Point, the cleaners were polishing the marble of a casino that had not yet been allowed to open a single poker table. The building had cost roughly $2.4 billion. It had been promised to the city as a monument to Australian ambition. What Adam Bell was about to uncover would turn it, almost overnight, into the most expensive empty room in the country. To understand how Australia built a casino industry worth more than its entire commercial fishing sector, and then nearly burned it to the ground in public, you have to go back 40 years to a beachside suburb in Tasmania, where the whole thing started with a man who hated losing. The man was Federal Hotel's Greg Farrell, but the real story begins earlier, with the opening of Wrest Point in Sandy Bay, Hobart, on the 10th of February 1973. It was Australia's first legal casino, approved by a state government that had run out of money and ideas at roughly the same time. Tasmania in the early 70s was bleeding people to the mainland, its apple industry collapsing, its shipping declining, its budget perpetually stitched together with Commonwealth grants. A casino was, in the language of the day, a circuit breaker. The cylindrical tower that rose above the Derwent River, all 73 meters of it, was meant to do what nothing else had managed: bring tourists, bring money, bring a reason for young Tasmanians to stay. On opening night, the queue stretched for hundreds of meters along Sandy Bay Road. The state government, watching the tills, realized it had stumbled onto something powerful. Within a decade, every other state was watching too. By 1985, the Northern Territory had Diamond Beach. By 1986, Queensland had Jupiter's on the Gold Coast. Adelaide, Perth, Canberra, Townsville, Launceston, Alice Springs. The states were issuing licenses like raffle tickets, each one a sealed monopoly with a tax pipeline running straight into Treasury. And it was in this moment, in the late 80s, that two men recognized that the real money was not in regional casinos serving local punters. It was in the two cities where the international high rollers actually wanted to be, Sydney and Melbourne. The men were Kerry Packer and Lloyd Williams. Williams was a Melbourne property developer with a horse racing obsession and a famously short temper. In 1993, his consortium, Crown Limited, won the license to build a casino on the south bank of the Yarra. The Victorian government of Jeff Kennett wanted it open fast and wanted it enormous. When Crown Casino finally launched its permanent complex in May 1997, it was briefly the largest casino in the Southern Hemisphere, 350 tables, 2,500 poker machines, its own railway entrance. Williams had built a city within a city, and within 3 years it was generating more than $1 billion a year in gaming revenue alone. Then Kerry Packer bought him out. Packer was, by then, the richest man in Australia, a media baron who won amounts of money at baccarat tables in London and Las Vegas that other billionaires used to buy houses. He understood instinctively what Williams had built. A Crown Casino was not really a casino. It was a machine for converting the gambling habits of wealthy mainland Chinese businessmen into Australian dollars, taxed once, banked forever. By 2007, Packer's son James had taken over the family company, rebranded it Crown Resorts, and set his ambitions on a second tower. This one in Sydney, this one taller, this one targeted at what the industry quietly called VIP international play. The Barangaroo project was approved in 2013 by the New South Wales government of Barry O'Farrell under an unsolicited proposal process that bypassed the usual competitive tender. The deal was extraordinary. Crown would be allowed to build a casino in the heart of Sydney with no poker machines, restricted to high roller play on prime harbourside land. In exchange, the state would collect a tax cut of the action and a skyline it could photograph. For a moment in the mid-2010s, Crown looked unstoppable. Its Melbourne complex alone employed more than 11,000 people. its junket partners flew in private jets full of clients from Macau, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. The high roller turnover at Crown Melbourne reached $58 billion in a single financial year. James Packer, photographed on yachts in the Mediterranean, was running what amounted to a private state within a state, with its own diplomatic relationships, its own intelligence operation, and its own rules. But the rules, it turned out, were the problem. In October 2016, 18 Crown employees were arrested in mainland China. They had been quietly marketing gambling trips inside a country where promoting offshore gambling is a criminal offense. Among them was Jason O'Connor, the head of Crown's international VIP business, a senior executive with direct lines to the Packer office. They were tried in Shanghai, convicted in June 2017, and sentenced to up to 10 months in prison. The arrests should have been a 5-alarm fire inside Crown's boardroom. They were instead treated as a temporary inconvenience. Internal emails later released in court showed that for years, executives had been warned repeatedly by their own staff on the ground that the China strategy was dangerous and possibly illegal. The warnings were minuted, circulated, and ignored. Then, on the 27th of July 2019, journalists Nick McKenzie and Grace Tobin of The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, 60 Minutes published the first installment of an investigation they had been working on for nearly 2 years. It was titled simply Crown Unmasked. The reporting alleged that Crown had partnered with junket operators linked to organized crime syndicates, including the Sun City Group run by Alvin Chow. A Macau businessman later sentenced to 18 years in prison for illegal gambling and triad-related offenses. The reporting alleged that Crown had facilitated visas for high rollers, later linked to drug trafficking. It alleged that Crown had allowed its bank accounts to be used in ways that any compliant financial institution would have flagged as money laundering. On a scale that defied imagination, the New South Wales government had a problem. It had handed Crown a license for Barangaroo on the assumption that Crown was a fit and proper operator. If the reporting was correct, that assumption was no longer tenable. The state's casino regulator, the Independent Liquor and Gaming Authority, appointed Adam Bell SC to conduct an inquiry. He began work in late 2019. By the time he opened that Manila folder in October 2020, he had access to thousands of internal documents, and the picture was worse than even The Age had reported. The Bell Inquiry's final report, delivered on the 1st of February 2021, found that Crown was not a suitable person to hold a casino license in New South Wales. The language was clinical, but the findings were devastating. Crown had facilitated money laundering through 2 subsidiaries, Riverbank and Southbank, whose bank accounts had been used to process structured cash deposits in patterns that any first-year compliance analyst would have recognized as suspicious. Crown had partnered with junket operators it knew, or should have known, were connected to organized crime. Crown had misled regulators. Crown had failed to act on warnings from its own staff, its own auditors, and its own law firms. Victoria followed. The Finkelstein Royal Commission, led by former federal court judge Ray Finkelstein QC, reported on the 15th of October 2021. It found that Crown Melbourne had underpaid state gaming taxes by at least $272 million through a process called bonus jackpot deductions, a scheme so convoluted that the company's own internal lawyers had described it as legally questionable. The commission found that Crown Melbourne had ignored its own responsible gambling obligations, that customers had been allowed to gamble for more than 24 hours straight without intervention, that staff had been instructed to encourage continued play over well-being. Finkelstein concluded in language that startled even seasoned regulatory lawyers that Crown's conduct had been illegal, dishonest, unethical, and exploitative. Western Australia ran its own Royal Commission, chaired by former Supreme Court Judge Neville Owen. It reported on the 4th of March 2022. It reached substantially the same conclusion. Crown Perth was not suitable to hold its license either. By this point, the protagonist of our story had become unrecognizable from the company James Packer had inherited. The board had been gutted, the CEO had resigned, the chairman had resigned. The senior international VIP team had been dismantled. The share price had collapsed from a peak of more than $17 in 2014 to under $8 by mid-2021. James Packer himself, in a video deposition that became one of the most discussed pieces of corporate footage in Australian history, admitted under questioning that mistakes had been made, that he had been embarrassed, that he had not known what was happening inside his own company. In May 2022, an American private equity firm called Blackstone completed its takeover of Crown Resorts in a deal worth $8.9 billion, taking the company private and removing it from the Australian Stock Exchange. The Packer family, after more than 50 years of dominance in Australian gambling, was out. Now here's the question. The Bell Inquiry, the Finkelstein Commission, and the Owen Commission all circled but never quite answered directly. How did this happen? How did three separate state governments with three separate regulators and decades of warnings allow a single company to become so powerful that it operated effectively beyond the law for the better part of a decade? The answer, when you trace it back through the documents, is uncomfortable. It is structural, and it is the central economic claim of this story. A 2017 study by Dr. Charles Livingston of Monash University's School of Public Health, Preventive Medicine, examined the political economy of gambling regulation in Australia across a 30-year period. His finding, published in the journal Addiction Research and Theory, was that state governments had become structurally dependent on gambling tax revenue that meaningful regulation had become almost impossible. In Victoria, gambling taxes accounted for between 7% and 10% of total state tax revenue. In New South Wales, the figure was similar, when a single company was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual tax payments, when it was employing tens of thousands of people, when its political donations were flowing to both major parties, when its lobbyists included former premiers, former police commissioners. The regulator was no longer regulating an industry, it was regulating its own paymaster. This is the pattern that repeats, not just in casinos, in poker machine venues, in sports betting, in online wagering. The Australian gambling industry generates more revenue per capita than any other country on earth. According to the Queensland Government Statisticians Office, total gambling losses by Australian adults in the 2021 to 2022 financial year reached $25 billion. That is more than the entire federal budget for higher education. It is more than the country spends on disability services. And every dollar of those losses is simultaneously a dollar of revenue for someone somewhere who has a strong interest in making sure the music keeps playing. The reckoning at Crown was real. The fines were substantial. AUSTRAC, the federal financial crimes regulator, secured penalties of $450 million against Crown in 2023 for breaches of anti-money laundering laws. The licenses in New South Wales, Victoria, and Western Australia were ultimately retained, but only on probation under the supervision of court-appointed managers. The Barangaroo Casino opened finally in August 2022, more than a year and a half after it had been ready, with new ownership and new compliance systems and a chastened, smaller ambition. But the underlying economics did not change. Blackstone did not pay $8.9 billion for a chastened company. It paid $8.9 billion because it believed correctly that Australians and the international visitors who come here would continue to gamble at scale, that state governments would continue to need the tax revenue, that the basic machinery of the industry would keep running, just with cleaner paperwork. The casino as a building, as a business model, as a relationship between private capital and public revenue was never the problem. The problem was that it had been allowed for too long to write its own rules. That conference room on the 20th floor in October 2020, where Adam Bell opened his Manila folder, was not the beginning of the end of the Australian casino. It was the moment the country decided to look, finally, at what it had built. What it saw was a $25 billion machine deeply embedded in the public finances of every state, employing tens of thousands of people, and structurally incapable of being properly supervised by the governments that depended on it. The reckoning was loud, the fines were record-breaking, the headlines were brutal, and yet the machine kept running, because the machine, in the end, was never just Crown, it was Australia. There is another building on another waterfront in another city where a near-identical story unfolded with a different name on the door and a different family at the top. Their name was The Star, and what happened to them in Sydney and on the Gold Coast makes the Crown story look like a dress rehearsal. That is where the brutal economics get even stranger. The Star Entertainment Group, which until 2011 had operated under the name Tabcorp Casinos, ran 3 of the largest gaming venues in the country: the Star Sydney at Piermont, the Star Gold Coast at Broadbeach and Treasury Brisbane, with a 4th, the colossal Queen's Wharf development in central Brisbane, under construction at a projected cost of $3.6 billion. By the time the Bell Inquiry's findings into Crown had been digested, New South Wales had already commissioned a parallel review into the Star led by Adam Bell, once again beginning in September 2021. The pattern that emerged was, if anything, more damning. Over the course of 73 days of public hearings, investigators traced $900 million in transactions disguised as hotel expenses on China UnionPay cards, a workaround that allowed mainland Chinese patrons to access gambling funds in direct violation of the card scheme's rules. They documented junket relationships with operators including Sun City, the same Macau-based group already flagged in the Crown proceedings. Run by Alvin Chow, who was arrested in November 2021 and later sentenced to 18 years in a Chinese prison, the Star's chief executive, Matt Beckier, resigned in March 2022. The chairman, John O'Neill, the former Wallabies boss and Football Australia chief, followed within weeks. By October 2022, the Star Sydney had been found unsuitable to hold its license. By December, the Queensland venues had received the same verdict. The fines stacked up: $100 million from New South Wales, another $100 million from Queensland, and then in 2024, a $15 million penalty levied by Austrac's successor proceedings, with further civil penalties pending that analysts estimated could exceed $400 million. The company's share price, which had traded above $4.50 in early 2018, collapsed to less than 25 cents by early 2025. Roughly $4.3 billion of market capitalization evaporated. And yet the Star, like Crown, did not close. It could not be allowed to. In Sydney alone, the casino directly employed more than 4,500 people, paid roughly $300 million annually in state gaming taxes, and anchored the redevelopment of the Piermont Peninsula, an area the New South Wales government had spent 2 decades trying to transform from disused container yards into a tourism precinct. In Queensland, the unfinished Queen's Wharf project carried obligations to more than 1,000 construction workers, dozens of subcontractors, and a state government that had staked its tourism strategy on the development's 2024 opening. Walking away was not an option for anyone involved. The buildings were too large, the payrolls too long, the tax flows too entrenched, the political embarrassment of a collapsed casino too severe for any premier to accept.